There is a power in stopping the chase, in refusing to constantly reach out, in deciding that your attention, your energy, and your emotions are no longer available for manipulation. When you stop pursuing someone who has a pattern of avoidance, it creates a shift that they cannot ignore. They are used to people bending, to people chasing, to people compromising themselves to keep them close. And when you remove that dynamic, when you redirect your focus to your own life, your own growth, your own happiness, it forces them to see the reality they have long avoided. Suddenly, your absence becomes more than a lack of presence. It becomes a mirror reflecting the consequences of their behavior, a reminder of the value they took for granted, and a signal that control no longer belongs to them. Stopping the chase is not about punishment. It is about reclaiming your power. It is about demonstrating that your world does not revolve around their whims. It is about showing that your attention is not a tool to be earned through manipulation. And that realization hits harder than any argument ever could. Avoidants are wired to retreat under pressure. They thrive on distance when provoked. They calculate and maneuver when they feel threatened. And your decision to stop chasing removes the fuel of their avoidance. It leaves them facing a vacuum they cannot fill. It leaves them confronted with the absence they assumed would always be filled. And that confrontation forces reflection because they begin to notice the impact of their actions without the distraction of your pursuit. They begin to see clearly the moments they hurt, the times they were distant, the choices they made that created gaps. And suddenly they realize that your presence was not something to be taken for granted. When you stop chasing, you are not being cruel. You are not being indifferent. You are simply creating space for self-respect, for clarity, and for accountability. And in that space, the avoidant cannot hide behind avoidance anymore. They cannot rationalize or manipulate the dynamic because the leverage they relied upon no longer exists. They notice the quiet strength in your independence, the way your life continues without their interference, the way your happiness is intact despite their distance. And that awareness is destabilizing because it contradicts every assumption they have held about relationships, about control, about how attention can be commanded. And it forces them to consider not just what they want, but what they have lost, and what they might never get back if they do not acknowledge it. Stopping the chase also communicates value without words. It is a demonstration that your care and attention are not infinite, that your time and energy have limits, and that you are not available for manipulation or testing. The avoidant begins to feel the absence in subtle ways. They notice the lack of messages, the lack of pursuit, the refusal to engage in drama or pleading, and it presses on them because it is steady, consistent, and unwavering. And in that pressure without confrontation, they are forced to confront the consequences of their avoidance, the hurt they caused, and the moments they failed to recognize your worth. Your independence becomes a reflection of what they can no longer take for granted. And that reflection hits harder than any reaction, any argument, any chase could ever produce. In that silence, in that withdrawal of pursuit, they start to measure the impact of their choices. They notice the gaps left behind. They see the moments they ignored or dismissed. They feel the weight of the absence they created, and it becomes undeniable, unavoidable, impossible to rationalize away. Your life moves forward with clarity, with purpose, with dignity, and they are forced to reckon with the reality that you are not theirs to control, that your presence is not theirs to command, and that your happiness does not require their approval. Every moment you live fully, every moment you prioritize yourself, every moment you maintain calm and confidence without chasing, becomes a lesson, a catalyst, a quiet force that challenges their avoidance and awakens awareness. Stopping the chase is a demonstration of love, not just for yourself, but for the relationship and for the other person, because it forces honesty, reflection, and accountability. It removes the distractions, the games, the manipulation, and it leaves only the truth, the undeniable reality of how your absence is felt, how your independence shines, and how your strength cannot be ignored. And as they face this truth, they are quietly compelled to reconcile, to acknowledge the hurt, to reflect on their actions, to realize the value they almost lost. Because nothing hits harder for an avoidant than the knowledge that the person they once took for granted is no longer chasing, that their attention is no longer guaranteed, that their presence is no longer demanded, and that realization is the catalyst for awareness, apology, and transformation. Every choice you make, to live fully, to prioritize yourself, to stop chasing, becomes a statement, a lesson, a mirror, and a force. It communicates powerfully that your life does not bend to avoidance, that your attention is not something to be manipulated, and that the consequences of their actions are real and undeniable. And in that force, in that quiet strength, the avoidant is faced with reflection, accountability, and the awakening to the reality that they cannot ignore, they cannot control, and they must reckon with the truth of their behavior. And your life, your independence, your calm, and your refusal to chase is what makes that awakening inevitable. Showing rather than reacting is a principle that carries more weight than words ever could. It is not about confrontation, pleading, or emotional explosions. It is about demonstrating your value, your strength, and your independence through your actions and presence. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional reaction. They are wired to retreat when they feel pressure or urgency. They analyze, calculate, and adjust according to the emotional cues around them. And when you replace reaction with calm demonstration, when you show who you are without needing their validation, it hits them in a way that no argument or chase ever could. Your life becomes proof of your worth, your happiness becomes a signal of your independence, and every subtle action communicates a message they cannot ignore. When you show instead of reacting, you bypass the defenses of avoidance. You disrupt the cycle of withdrawal and emotional games. Because avoidants thrive on unpredictability and pressure, they are accustomed to scenarios where reaction creates control, where drama provokes engagement, and where chasing validates presence. But when you maintain composure and demonstrate your life without reacting to their avoidance, you remove the levers they relied on, and suddenly they are confronted with the reality that your value is inherent, that your presence is not contingent on their attention, and that your calm and steady demonstration of self-respect forces them to reflect on what they have lost, what they have taken for granted, and the impact of their own actions on the connection. Showing rather than reacting also communicates strength without aggression. It signals that you are unshakable, that your life continues with or without their participation, and that your boundaries and priorities cannot be manipulated through emotional pressure. Avoidants are often experts at deflecting responsibility, at rationalizing behavior, at retreating emotionally to avoid discomfort. And when you demonstrate rather than react, you remove the tools they rely on. You force them into a space of awareness where they must confront their own avoidance, their own choices, their own behavior. And that confrontation is uncomfortable but necessary. It creates the conditions for reflection, for guilt, for acknowledgement, and eventually for apology. Your actions become a language they understand intuitively, because avoidants are often more responsive to demonstration than to words. They notice when you prioritize yourself, when you maintain calm in the face of avoidance, when you live fully without seeking their approval. And those behaviors communicate far more than explanations or ultimatums ever could. They force recognition, they force awareness, and they force the internal reckoning that is required for accountability. Every small choice you make to maintain dignity, every refusal to react emotionally, every moment of composure in the face of hurt, reinforces the message that your worth is independent, that your life is autonomous, and that reconciliation requires them to confront their own behavior rather than manipulate yours. When avoidants witness you showing rather than reacting, they experience a subtle but powerful disruption in their usual patterns. They are confronted with a reality where their avoidance no longer dictates outcomes, where their withdrawal no longer elicits pursuit, and where your calm, independent life forces them to reckon with the consequences of their actions. They begin to see the gaps they created, the moments they hurt, the opportunities for connection they ignored, and they cannot evade the awareness that your strength and composure highlight. It presses on them quietly but persistently. It unsettles them without confrontation. It awakens reflection without demand, and it compels them to acknowledge their behavior, because the reality you demonstrate cannot be ignored, rationalized away, or manipulated. This principle also works because it removes the emotional fuel they depend on. Avoidants are often reactive to others' emotional instability. They respond to chaos, drama, and urgent pursuit, and when you show instead of react, you deny them the patterns they rely on. You deny them the opportunity to manipulate response through pressure, and in that denial, you create a space where self-awareness and acknowledgement must emerge naturally. They are forced to confront the gap between how they behaved and how they are perceived, the difference between their intentions and their impact, and the consequences of their avoidance. And as they sit in that reflection, the natural outcome becomes a growing awareness that apology is necessary, that recognition is required, and that accountability cannot be avoided. Every moment of demonstration, every act of calm composure, every choice to live fully without reacting becomes a quiet force, a mirror reflecting the impact of avoidance, a teacher illuminating the gap between behavior and consequence, and a catalyst compelling recognition and reconciliation. They notice the difference between your calm strength and their own evasion. They see clearly the hurt they caused, the absence they created, and the perpetrated respect they failed to honor. And in witnessing your life, your boundaries, your independence, and your composed self-respect, they are forced to face the truth that acknowledgement, apology, and accountability are not optional. They are necessary if any connection is to remain, and the power of showing, rather than reacting, becomes the undeniable lesson they cannot escape. Consistency over reaction is a principle that carries an incredible weight when dealing with someone who has a pattern of avoidance. It is not about confrontation. It is not about creating drama. It is about maintaining steady boundaries, calm presence, and unwavering composure. Avoidants are accustomed to emotional volatility. They thrive on reactions. They manipulate through chaos, and they retreat when pressured or challenged. But when you consistently hold your boundaries, maintain your dignity, and refuse to react to provocation, you create a reality they cannot control. You force them to confront the profound consequences of their behavior, and that confrontation begins subtly but powerfully. It presses on them without words. It teaches lessons without aggression, and it communicates your worth more effectively than pleading, chasing, or emotional displays ever could. When you practice consistency over reaction, you remove the leverage they have relied on to manipulate and evade responsibility. Avoidants are experts at creating dynamics where their withdrawal provokes pursuit, where their distance compels chase, and where emotional escalation serves as a tool to maintain control. And when you refuse to engage in those cycles, when you respond with calm steadiness, they are forced to face the reality that your life, your peace, and your self-respect are independent of their behavior. Every moment you maintain composure, despite provocation, reinforces the lesson that their avoidance cannot dictate outcomes, that their distance cannot force attention, and that your strength is not something they can manipulate or undermine. Consistency also communicates clarity. It shows that your boundaries are not flexible depending on their whims, that your values are not negotiable, and that your self-respect is non-negotiable. Avoidants are often unaware of the ways their actions hurt others. They rationalize, deflect, and retreat from accountability, and the steady enforcement of your boundaries removes the ambiguity they rely on. It forces awareness, it forces reflection, and it forces them to recognize that their avoidance has tangible consequences. Every calm, measured response, every moment of unwavering composure becomes a mirror showing the impact of their choices. It creates a pressure that is internal and unavoidable. It awakens a sense of guilt and reflection that cannot be escaped by retreat or indifference, and that internal reckoning often leads to acknowledgement and apology. Over time, consistency erodes the patterns of avoidance without confrontation, without manipulation, without drama, because it demonstrates a truth that words alone cannot convey. It shows that your life continues with integrity and calm, regardless of their behavior, that your attention, care, and presence are not tools to be earned through manipulation or evasion, and that the consequences of their avoidance are unavoidable in the face of unwavering composure. Avoidants begin to notice the absence of leverage, the inability to provoke a reaction, and the steady, calm assertion of your self-respect, and that realization forces them to confront the emotional gap they created, the hurt they caused, and the respect they failed to honor, because consistency teaches lessons silently, relentlessly, without aggression, and it communicates accountability more effectively than confrontation ever could. Maintaining consistency over reaction also reduces the chaos that avoidants rely upon to protect themselves. They are often reactive to instability. They retreat when emotions are heightened. They evade responsibility when they feel pressure. And when you refuse to react emotionally, you remove the fuel they depend on. You deny them the leverage of drama, and you create a space where awareness, reflection, and accountability can arise naturally. They begin to see the contrast between your calm, consistent presence and their own evasive patterns. They notice the impact of their behavior, the ways they hurt, the ways they withdrew, and the ways they assumed their absence or avoidance would go unnoticed. And in that noticing, they are compelled to reflect, to feel, and eventually to acknowledge. Every choice to remain consistent, every refusal to be drawn into reactive patterns, every maintenance of calm boundaries reinforces the truth that your life is autonomous, your emotions are your own, and your value is inherent. It communicates clearly that apology and acknowledgement are necessary if connection is to continue, and that realization cannot be ignored, rationalized away, or avoided. Consistency forces introspection in a way that words, chasing, or emotional pleading never could. It creates a mirror for reflection, a teacher for accountability, and a catalyst compelling recognition, guilt, and reconciliation. Because avoidants are confronted with a reality they cannot manipulate, cannot control, and cannot escape, and your unwavering composure and steady presence demand that they reckon with the consequences of their behavior. Ultimately, consistency over reaction is a force that transforms avoidance into acknowledgement, that converts withdrawal into reflection, and that replaces emotional evasion with awareness. It removes manipulation, it removes ambiguity, it removes the patterns they rely upon, and in its place it creates clarity, responsibility, and accountability. The avoidant cannot help but notice, reflect, and confront, and that confrontation quietly guides them toward recognition, apology, and the understanding that their actions have consequences, because when you consistently maintain calm, dignity, and boundaries without reacting to avoidance, the lessons are unavoidable. The awareness is undeniable, and the path to accountability becomes clear and inescapable. Living fully and inspiring reflection is a principle that carries immense power when dealing with someone who has a pattern of avoidance. It is not about showing off. It is not about creating jealousy. It is about embracing your life, pursuing your growth, nurturing your happiness, and prioritizing your fulfillment in ways that cannot be ignored. Avoidants are highly attuned to the emotional presence of others. They notice absence, they notice engagement, and they notice when someone is thriving independently and when you live fully. When you cultivate a life rich with purpose, joy, and achievement, it becomes a mirror that reflects back the consequences of their avoidance, the moments they hurt, and the gaps they created. And in that, reflection, awareness, and accountability begin to stir. When you live fully, every choice you make to pursue your goals, to nurture your passions, to surround yourself with positivity and growth, communicates a truth that words cannot. It signals that your happiness is not contingent on their presence, that your self-worth is inherent and non-negotiable, and that your life will not pause or diminish because of their withdrawal or avoidance. Avoidants are often dependent on the reactions, attention, or pursuit of others to maintain emotional equilibrium. They are accustomed to scenarios where chasing, pleading, or emotional manipulation reinforces their sense of control. And when you remove those dynamics by thriving without them, it challenges their assumptions, disrupts their patterns, and forces them to confront the reality that their actions have consequences and that reflection and acknowledgement are unavoidable. Living fully also forces reflection because it creates contrast. The eccentric avoidant begins to notice the difference between the life you are building and the way they have acted. They see the opportunities for connection they ignored, the moments they failed to honor your presence, and the ways their avoidance caused hurt. And that contrast is destabilizing in a way that silence, chasing, or anger cannot achieve. They begin to measure what they have lost, what they almost lost, and what they might never regain. And in that measurement, the stirrings of regret, awareness, and the desire to reconcile emerge. Your independence becomes a catalyst for their reflection, your joy becomes a trigger for awareness, and your fulfillment becomes a quiet teacher that guides them toward accountability without confrontation. Every step you take to live fully, every moment you dedicate to your growth, every choice to nurture your happiness communicates more than any argument or ultimatum. Avoidants notice subtleties, the way you hold your head high, the way you engage confidently with the world, the way your life moves forward with purpose and clarity, and those subtleties force them to reckon with their own patterns, their own avoidance, and the impact of their behavior on the connection. They cannot manipulate the lessons you demonstrate through action. They cannot deflect from the awareness that your fulfillment is independent, and they are compelled to confront the fact that reconciliation, acknowledgement, and apology are the only paths forward if they wish to restore balance. Living fully also removes the emotional leverage that avoidants often depend on. They are sensitive to pursuit, reaction, and dependence, and when you refuse to let your happiness hinge on their behavior, when you create a life that thrives independently of their presence, you take away the tools they rely on to avoid accountability. They cannot control your emotions. They cannot manipulate your actions, and they are left to sit with the consequences of their behavior, the absence they created, and the impact of their avoidance. And in that space, reflection, guilt, and recognition of their actions emerge naturally, quietly, without force, because your life itself communicates truth in a way that words or chasing never could. The avoidant begins to recognize patterns they had dismissed, moments they had ignored, and the emotional void their avoidance created. And that recognition is amplified by the contrast of your thriving life, your fulfillment, and your independence. They feel the weight of what they almost lost, the absence of control they assumed they had, and the clarity of your composed, self-directed life becomes a mirror reflecting the reality of their choices. They begin to understand that apology is necessary, that acknowledgement is unavoidable, and that reconciliation requires awareness and accountability. And all of this occurs without you pleading, chasing, or reacting. It happens because your life, your actions, and your fulfillment communicate powerfully, steadily, and undeniably. Every choice to embrace your life fully, to prioritize your goals, to pursue happiness, and to cultivate growth becomes a silent but potent force that compels reflection in the avoidant. It demonstrates that your presence is not theirs to command, that your attention is not a tool, and that your value is inherent and undeniable. They are confronted with the contrast between your thriving existence and their own patterns of avoidance. They see clearly the gaps they created, the hurt they caused, and the consequences of their actions. And that confrontation sparks awareness, guilt, and eventually acknowledgement. Because when you live fully, when your fulfillment is independent, and when your life shines with clarity and purpose, it becomes impossible for them to ignore, manipulate, or evade the truth. And in that quiet yet powerful reflection, they are compelled toward recognition, apology, and accountability.